Hello boys and girls, welcome back to my channel. This is the third episode dealing with Amram Barr's claim that he was disinherited after his father had given compensation, his reparations from Germany to the Kibbutz. And before I give my personal opinion, because in a way I'm replying on behalf of all Kibbutzim that made the change and those that went into privatization of assets. Before I give my personal opinion, I want to thank Amram very much, because he is one of the few people who've opened up a topic here that I would say all Kibbutzim do not want to talk about in public. And what I'll do is I'll read some of his comments, and we'll start with that if I can find it here on my laptop. Let me see. He writes, let me just scroll down. The most disappointing and insulting part of this whole thing is not the deprivation of the most basic human right afforded to people in the free world to be entitled to inherit from their parents. Surely I've lost an incalculable amount of assets in the process, while others have not. The only acknowledgement I've ever heard from a dear friend I used to be very close to, he said they, that means members of Kibbutzim, in this case Givat Chaim Ichud, referred to those of us who were left out as Yitomei Hayom HaKoveh, translated into Hebrew, orphans of the day of reckoning. And in response to that, let me just see, where are we? Empress 2529 replied, well, this can be seen as a person who worked and invested time and money in the company. Then the person among the founders died. Most of the founders died. They were not just founders, they were owners. Now that the company was sold, of course, that the families of the founders and owners should receive assets or money, even if they were not working in the company. I don't understand how it was legal not to compensate the families of the founder owners. Well, first of all, the comparison is not correct. Kibbutz as an organization cannot be compared to a regular corporation with business assets and owners. Kibbutz is legally established in Israel as an Agoda Shitufit, as a cooperative organization, which has many, many more facets than just the business side of the organization. And that person, right, I don't understand how it was legal not to compensate the families of the founder members. Well, all of the years of the existence of every kibbutz as a cooperative organization, they have been recognized by the law in Israel to establish their own internal laws and regulations. So every government, from the early days of the Labour government through to the last let's say 30, 40 years, mainly of a right-wing government, have recognized the fact, legally established it, that kibbutzim can make their own laws, providing they do not contravene the laws of the country. And Amram wrote back, the only way it became legal was because they wrote their own new laws tailored to fit their needs. Well, as I've said, that was legal within the country. And then he adds, for instance, the guy in the picture next to me by the pool was one of my best friends. We grew up together from a very early age. He too left the kibbutz many years ago. Him and his two brothers did inherit their family's home and undisclosed sums of German reparations from their mother, who was a Holocaust survivor, who lived a long life in the kibbutz, yet his best friend, i.e. Amram, Amram, got nothing. Generally speaking, about the assets of the kibbutz, this is a tale of two kibbutzim, Givat Chaim Ichud and Givat Chaim Ichud, which were one kibbutz founded in 1932, separated into two kibbutzim in 1950, prior to which in 1942 the main industry, the juice factory of Prigat, was established, firstly to supply jam to the British Mandate Tommies, and then it went on to becoming a canning factory and the juice factory, etc. This factory, Prigat, from 1942, provided a large income for the one kibbutz of Givat Chaim, and then for the two kibbutzim after they split in 1950. Not all homes or assets were privatized in both kibbutzim. My kibbutz decided to make differential salaries, and while I was preparing what I'm going to say now, what I am saying now, I came across an old file that I wrote from 2011, in which I suggested a way and means of how my kibbutz, Givat Chaim Ichud, could privatize homes. But when it came to the vote, my kibbutz decided not to privatize homes. Regarding the Prigat factory, that was privatized, and in stages from 2008, I'll just look at the figures here, the Prigat company was sold to the Coca-Cola Carlsberg company in Israel, which is named the Central Bottling Company, and in 2008 18% was sold for a 51% controlling interest, and it was sold for 80 million shekels, and it was sold in stages up to about 2017, let's say, or 18, let's say 5 years ago. And I don't know exactly what the figures were, but let's say we can add on another 80 million shekels, 160 million shekels altogether, maybe more. By the way, selling off of kibbutz factories was and still is a big trend in Israel. Then in 2008, I think it was, the market value of the company was 350 million shekels, with a turnover of 700 million shekels. Yes, okay. Now, as it was jointly owned by two kibbutzim, my kibbutz, more or less, we can say, had about, then in 2007, about 400 members. I would assume that Givat Chaim Ichud had the same number of members. So let's round it off in figures, that and I'm not precise about the numbers here, but I'm giving you a general estimate so that in fact Amram can get some figures here. Generally speaking, let's say that the total amount of money that both kibbutzim got was 160 million shekels, maybe more, I don't know, which was divided among a total plus minus of 1,000 members. But let's just remember one salient piece of information. As in every business, it's not what your income is. It's not how many members of the family are supported by that income. What is important, and to understand the value of what you have is not your income, but your expenses. I do not know what the expenses of Givat Chaim Ichud were, and what they are now, but I do know in my own kibbutz in Uchad that we owed 80 million shekels to the bank, as I've already mentioned, and we weren't even repaying that debt. We were only paying off the interest, which was a terrible state. So we made the change here in February 2002, and it took us from that date 8 or 9 years to pay off 80 million shekels to the banks. Let's say that Givat Chaim Ichud had the same debt. To cancel the total debt of 160 million shekels, that was what it was all about. So to try to give a direct answer to Amram, what was his inheritance? We are talking here about the right to inherit his parents' house. So what are his rights? Well, let's go back even further to what I define as the golden age of kibbutzim. From 1967 to 1977. Why do I define this as the golden age, or the later part of the golden age of kibbutzim? Because in 1967 we won the Six-Day War. There was complete elation over this in Israel, where in fact we regained Jerusalem, we got control of the West Bank, we had the Sinai Peninsula with the oil fields that we gave back to Egypt. This was a 10-year critical period for Amram when he was in his formative years, from early adolescence, age 12, to 1977, when he was 20. During that time, he was in school and then in the Air Force. So let's look at what Amram got in that 10-year period. Well, he got the best education in the world, or at least the best education in Israel. As a young boy in Givat Chaim Ichud, he received a very, very good education. He also had the rights to go on to further education in the kibbutz after his military service, without any payment at all for higher studies, university. The only condition was that he had to work in the kibbutz for a number of years after the Air Force, 3 or 4 years like everybody else. And he chose not to take up that option. And I'll quote him. He wrote to me in an email. He said, I didn't want to shovel in the cowsheds. And that was a perfectly legitimate decision. Not everybody enjoys hard physical work. I do, others do, and others did. But he, as many of the kids of kibbutz, decided that was not for them. In other words, their parents' ideology and ideals did not oblige them to follow through in the same way. As I said, it was completely legitimate for him to leave the kibbutz. Amram left Givat Chaim Ichud in 1979 when he was 22. Prior to that, 2 years earlier, there had been a complete, how can I say, change in government in Israel. First 29 years of Israel's independence, the Labour government had held power and strongly supported the kibbutzim. In 1977, what we call the Mahapach, the revolution, or whatever you want to call it in English, when the right-wing government came into power under Menachem Begin. But the effect of the withdrawal of political and economic support by the government that started in 1977 was not really felt by the kibbutzim until 3, 4, 5 years later, when in fact the whole of Israel went into recession in 1982-83. So Amram left at a time, as I said, during the latter part of the golden age of the kibbutzim, when we were living well. The Begin government strongly criticized us. Begin himself said, "Oh, the millionaires in kibbutz sitting by the sides of the swimming pool." Well, that was the perception of people right-wing outside of the kibbutz. It was a perception, but we had well earned that by being a pioneering society for all the previous years, when in fact we had made great efforts and had a lot of, let's say, hard work or suffering, whatever you want to call it. Now, Amram in 1979, he relinquished all of that. If he were a member and had stayed on, which he chose not to, and that was his legitimate right, he could have become a member of his kibbutz and, like others, would have received some form of compensation, but he left. Then the next period after that, we went into 10 or 15 years of absolute financial disaster. I can call this the dark ages of kibbutzim. If you want to call it the period of shock and awe, we were absolutely dumbfounded and didn't know how to deal with the situation. There were social hardships because the young people of the kibbutz, after Amram left, the young people of the kibbutz left en masse. 90, maybe 95% of the young people walked out of the kibbutzim and left nobody really to run the shop. We were all becoming an old age colony without the means of paying for our existence. In the kibbutz Givat Chaim Ichud, the average age was 57. I remember in Amiyat, Barry Coleman in episode 3 said that the average age there was 62, and this was across all of the kibbutzim. The kibbutzim were turning into old age homes without sufficient income. So while we, in all of the kibbutzim, or in this case the tale of two kibbutzim, Kibbutz Givat Chaim Ichud and Kibbutz Givat Chaim Ichud, were going through a very, very difficult time, what was Amram doing during that period? Well, from the age of 22, he went to the States. By the way, I didn't mention that the golden age of kibbutzim after 1967 started the whole volunteer movement of originally people within the first 24 hours who wanted to volunteer to fight for Israel, but very quickly it established the organization when there was the influx over 30 years of 300,000 volunteers who came to live and work in kibbutz and enjoy life in the kibbutzim. And among them, from what Amram told me, in the Ichud, he had an American girlfriend, a volunteer, And he chose to go to the States with her. He got a green card, again legitimate, and he started working in the United States. Now, over a period of 10, 20, 30, 40 years, obviously as a very capable and intelligent guy, he started to work. Probably he went, toured around like many young kibbutz after the army. Maybe he backpacked around, but he obviously started working and went later on, or at some stage, I don't know, I'm presuming he went into business. I know that just recently, according to his email address, his business, a trucking company in the United States, closed. I presume maybe because he sold it, maybe because he retired, I don't know. But he worked very hard and built up a very, very good standard of living. During that period, during the first 10 or 15 years after he left, we were going through economic and social disruption, and I would even say hell, because in fact we didn't have a proper income because our expenses were eating away everything. I want to add here that Amram's case was one of thousands all over the kibbutzim. He was no exception. And to elucidate a little bit further here, I will give you a little bit of my own personal story. I didn't want this channel to be about me, but because in fact we are talking about being disinherited, I myself am a widower. My wife died in 1991 before we made the change. I was left with two young children, a boy aged 4 and a girl aged 8. Prior to all of that, when we returned as a family in 1986 from England, we saw the emotional and financial disaster happening in our kibbutz, and we decided to leave. But once my wife was diagnosed with cancer, and she managed to survive for 2.5 years until 1991, we realized we could not leave, and our own personal plans just went out of the window. Amram was fortunate enough to be young and healthy and single, and he left the kibbutz before all of the bigger collapse. However, with me, my position left me looking after 2 young kids. I had no money in the bank. The kibbutz was many years before we made the change to salarization. Again, we didn't make the change to privatization of houses. And as I said, I had no money in the bank, so I was stuck in kibbutz. And while my friend Barry Coleman in Amiad in episode 3 talked about kibbutz as utopia, during those years, I can very much describe it as the opposite. It was a complete dystopia, with people scratching their heads wondering, how are we going to survive? And discussions went on for a long, long time. But in my personal case, I had a widower's pension coming in of about 3,500 shekels a month. And all of that from February 1991 until we made the change in February 2002, all of that went into the coffers of the kibbutz. I did in no way benefit directly or financially. I would say that somewhere in the region, while Amram is claiming for the value monetization of his parents' house, I was living in kibbutz, and I would say over a total of 10 or 11 years, probably 1.3 million shekels went into the coffers of my kibbutz, with none of it going to me. I am not the only person with this situation that happened. By the way, I did claim some of the money much later on, in later years, 5 or 7 years after my wife died, and the kibbutz refused to give me some of them or all of that money. And that's the way it was. We had internal laws, and I myself tried the best with the help and advice of friends. I even considered. Now here I relate to what one of the readers responded to Amram. They said, well, you know, about the legality of the situation. Or other people said, well, you know, why didn't people in Amram's case bring a class action? I even considered, I went outside the kibbutz round about the year 2001, and I found a lawyer, and I stated my case, and he said, I do have a legal right to claim some of my widower's pension from the national insurance company. And I considered it and I looked at it, but I already realized I could feel the winds of change coming. Not just feel it, but I myself was very active in initiating it. And I said to myself, you know, if I make a legal claim for that money, then I'm a real fool over this, real idiot. I said to myself, well, when I start making a claim for that money, who will the money come from? And it will come from other members of the kibbutz and my close personal friends who may even agree with me. And I decided, as I said, I felt the winds of change. It was probably 6 or 9 months before we made the change to salarization. So I made a little compromise agreement with the kibbutz over the 6 months prior to salarization and the change. But as I said, I could have made a legal claim for about a total of 1.3 million shekels. I was not the only one in this situation. We were not just talking about widowers' pensions. We were talking about other people who had pensions and reparations coming in from Germany and all different sources or whatever it was, whereby prior to the change, that money went into the bank account of the kibbutzim. Let's say that nobody's perfect. And when you have a group of people working together in a kibbutz and living together, everybody could even be pulling in different directions, and committees were set up to make the change in Givat Chaim Ichud and to establish the day of a reckoning. I'm sure mistakes were made. Mistakes were made here. Again, as Barry Coleman stated in episode 3, there was a level in his kibbutz and in other kibbutzim of unfairness, but it was such a complex situation, and it begs me to ask the question about the day of reckoning, and how far back could any kibbutz go in setting up a compensation system. The day of reckoning was a watershed. In the case of the Ichud, in Givat Chaim Ichud, what was it? In 2004 they had the Day of Reckoning. Could they go back to 2002? Could they go back to people who left in the year 1990? Could they go back to the year 1986 when Amram's father died? How far can you go back in this maelstrom and this very complex situation to compensate people? And how would you compensate people who left before the Day of Reckoning? Would you compensate them on the basis of how many years' work they had had worked in the kibbutz based on their seniority in the membership line of kibbutzim? Would you go back to their money, their rights, their reparations, their pensions, and everything else that they had given to the kibbutzim? If you go back in stages, it's just too complicated an issue for any organization, let alone a kibbutz with, let's say, 400 or 500 members, again the Ichud, in which they were struggling to survive and not go to the wall, in other words, to collapse, because kibbutzim during that crisis in the 80s and 90s had gone to the wall, like Kibbutz Ha'on, like Kibbutz Mishmar David. Were many with their backs up against the wall, and only by virtue of the fact that they were part of a larger organization, the kibbutz movement, that somehow, in some cases like Kibbutz Gezer and other kibbutzim, many were abandoned for many years and then reformulated and resettlement by groups coming in and individuals. But perhaps it could have happened. It was very much on the cards with larger kibbutzim, Givat Chaim Ichud and Muchad. And in fact, if we didn't make the change, we would not have survived. So the question is based around the rights of Amram's inheritance on the Day of Reckoning. Well, very simply, somebody had to make a decision. And in the case of all kibbutzim, it was better to make a decision than not make a decision. Mistakes were made, I'm sure of it. Unfairness, yes. But remember, 80, 90, 95% of the kibbutz children had left. And my answer, in short, directly to Amram Barr, is yes, I empathize with him. However, does he or did he really understand what our situation was during the 10 or 15 years in the 80s or the 90s, or what the situation was in the Ichud? Did he really see it from the inside, or does he only see it from the legal standpoint of a guy working and making a living and earning money and gaining assets outside of kibbutz? He's not judging it fairly as far as I'm concerned. I'm sorry to say, Amram, I really apologize because I understand your feeling. But do you understand our feeling that we went through a very, very rough time, and any reparations that your father received, basically, I am sure they were all swallowed up by debts to the bank. And it was only after, I want to make the analogy of the phoenix rising from the ashes, did Givat Chaim Ichud and Givat Chaim Muchad come out of this beneficially. So were you disinherited? My personal opinion is no, you were not disinherited, because the money whereby in the Ichud, again in the Muchad, we do not own our own houses, but in the Ichud, that money, the monetization of houses, I think, and the value of the houses was made well after that kibbutz paid its debts to the banks. In other words, how long? 42 years after you left. Again, I replied to the person who said, well, you know, it's like a normal corporation. Completely not like a normal corporation. The whole infrastructure of the social and economy is completely different, so the comparison is not valid. I'm very sorry, Amram. I feel that you were not disinherited. And that's it. There we are. I'm now finishing this episode, and the next episode, if we already started the story of A Tale of Two Kibbutzim, will be about Kibbutz Givat Chaim Ichud, either the story of the Holocaust survivor, the oldest lady member of our kibbutz, who is now 98 and in good health, Tzipora Hochman, who is a survivor of Auschwitz, and the oldest guy in our kibbutz, who is now 95 or 96, my friend Reuven Lichtner, whom I worked with 40 odd years ago in the orange orchards, and he will tell his personal story. So the next episode 1 or 2 after this will be, you could entitle it, Every Man and Every Woman in Kibbutz Has a Story. That's it for now. Bye, keep well, shalom, and leitraot.